"I'll be gentle," Victor whispered that night, a lie that cut deeper than any wound he'd ever given. But the real violence wasn't in his hands. It was in the truth he was about to speak. The master suite was hushed when they entered. Too hushed. The air held the weight of expectation, of what a wedding night should be. Nancy stepped across the threshold, her white gown whispering against marble floors. The bedroom stretched before her, gold and black, elegant and imprisoning. Rose petals scattered across silk sheets. A romantic tableau that mocked the reality of what this marriage truly was. He promised her gentleness on their wedding night. What he gave her instead would shatter everything she believed about her father, her life, and the man who now owned her future. As we continue, click subscribe. Like this video and tell me in the comment where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's continue in the story. Victor moved behind her, his footsteps measured, deliberate. He shrugged off his suit jacket with the same controlled precision he used to command his empire. "You're trembling, Mrs. Waltrip," he said, his voice dark velvet wrapped around steel. Nancy didn't turn. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor-to-ceiling windows, on Chicago's glittering skyline beyond the glass. A city of millions, and she'd never felt more alone. "Are you afraid of me?" he pressed. "I just want this night to end," she whispered, the truth escaping before she could cage it. She heard him move closer, felt the heat of him at her back, his breath against her neck. "It won't hurt," he murmured. "I'll be gentle." The words should have been a comfort. Instead, they landed like a threat she didn't yet understand. His tone wasn't reassurance, it was something far more dangerous. Nancy spun to face him, her eyes blazing despite the tremor in her hands. "You don't have to prove anything. You already have what you wanted. Isn't that enough?" Something flickered across Victor's face, pain, perhaps, or rage, or guilt, she couldn't tell. For a heartbeat, he looked almost human. Then his jaw hardened, his steel-gray eyes going cold again. "I don't want your fear, Nancy," he said quietly. "I want your understanding." Tears burned at the corners of her eyes. "Then you'll never have either." The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire about to snap. Then Victor moved to the bedside table and pulled out a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the bed, scattering rose petals like drops of blood. Not touching her, not moving toward her, just standing there, with that file between them like a grenade with the pin already pulled. "Your father," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Robert Sparks, federal agent, hero, martyr?" Nancy's breath caught. "Don't you dare—" "He betrayed my family," Victor continued, relentless. "He fed intelligence to my enemies. He got 12 people killed, including a 6-year-old girl." The room tilted. Nancy grabbed the bedpost for support, her vision swimming. "You're lying," she choked out. Victor's expression didn't change. He simply gestured to the folder. "Read it yourself. Every bank transaction. Every intercepted communication. Everybody he left in his wake." Nancy's legs gave out. She sank onto the bed, white gown pooling around her like a shroud, rose petals crushed beneath her weight. Her hands shook as she opened the folder, as photographs spilled out. Surveillance images, case files, victims' faces frozen in death. Her father's signature at the bottom of damning reports. "No," she breathed. "No, no, no." "This is my gentleness," Victor said, his voice almost kind. "I could have hurt you 1,000 ways tonight. but I'd rather you understand why you're here. Your marriage to me isn't politics, Nancy. It's payment. Your father's debt, paid in flesh." He turned and walked toward the door, leaving her there among the ruins of everything she'd believed. "Sleep if you can," he said without looking back. "Tomorrow, you'll start learning what it means to be my wife." The lock clicked. Nancy was alone. She sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, the evidence of her father's sins scattered across the bed like shrapnel. That night, surrounded by rose petals and lies, the last piece of her innocence shattered. And Victor Waltrip, the man who'd married her for vengeance, began to realize something that terrified him. The woman he'd tried to break might be the only one capable of breaking him. Days crawled by like wounded animals. Nancy moved through Victor's mansion like a ghost, silent, watchful, untouchable. The staff learned to avert their eyes. The guards bowed but kept their distance. She had everything wealth could provide: designer clothes, jewels, servants at her beck and call. But none of it felt real. Victor kept his distance too. When he did speak to her, it was through commands delivered with cold courtesy. "Don't leave the estate. Don't question the business. Don't challenge me." But Nancy was done being obedient. She explored his domain with quiet defiance, reading the books in his private library, rearranging objects in his study, speaking to his men when he'd forbidden it. Small rebellions, perhaps, but enough to make the staff whisper. Enough to make Victor watch her from the shadows, his expression unreadable. One evening, Nancy found him in his study, staring at something on his desk. She stood in the doorway, watching. He didn't seem to notice her at first, too absorbed in whatever memory held him captive. "Who is she?" Nancy asked softly. Victor's head snapped up. For a moment, vulnerability flashed across his face, raw and bleeding. Then his mask slammed back into place. "No one you need to worry about," he said, his voice carefully empty. But Nancy had already seen the photograph in his hands. A young woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. A woman wearing a wedding dress. "You loved her," Nancy said. Not a question, a statement of fact. Victor's laugh was bitter, broken. "Love got her killed." The words hung in the air like smoke. For the first time, Nancy glimpsed the man beneath the monster. The one buried under scar tissue and rage. "Go to bed, Nancy," he said, standing abruptly, walls rebuilding with every breath. "Don't play with things you don't understand." But she wasn't the terrified girl from their wedding night anymore. "I understand pain," Nancy said quietly, meeting his storm-gray eyes with her own fire. "And loneliness. Maybe more than you think." Their gazes locked. Something passed between them, fragile, dangerous, undefined. When Nancy left, Victor remained behind, gripping the photograph until his knuckles turned white. He didn't want to admit it, but her defiance had awakened something in him. Something he'd thought died with Isabel. Nancy was supposed to be his prisoner. Instead, she was slowly becoming his obsession. The master suite was a monument to wealth and cruelty. Gold accents gleamed against black silk walls. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across marble floors, and rose petals, blood red against white sheets, created a scene of romance that felt like mockery. Nancy stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, her reflection ghostly against Chicago's glittering skyline. Behind her, she heard the clink of glass against glass. "Whiskey?" Victor's voice cut through the silence. She didn't turn. "No. Suit yourself." The sound of liquid pouring, then his footsteps approaching, He stopped just behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "You think you know who your father was?" Nancy's spine stiffened. "Don't. Robert Sparks, decorated federal agent, died in the line of duty. Hero to his daughter." Victor moved past her, circling like a predator teaching his prey the boundaries of the cage. "That's the story they told you." "It's the truth." But her voice wavered. Victor set his glass down and retrieved the manila folder from the bed. He opened it with deliberate slowness, spreading documents across the silk sheets. Rose petals scattered, and suddenly they looked less like romance and more like bloodstains. "Agent Robert Sparks wasn't killed in the line of duty," Victor said, his tone devoid of emotion. "He was executed for betrayal." Nancy's breath caught. "You're insane." "I wish I was." Victor pulled out surveillance photographs, bank statements, intercepted communications. "For 2 years, your father fed intelligence to the Kozlov family. My enemies. He told them where my shipments would be, where my men would strike, where my family was vulnerable. No, 12 people died because of your father's information." Victor's voice remained steady, clinical. "Including a 6-year-old girl named Sophia. She was at the wrong warehouse at the wrong time because your father told the Kozlovs it would be empty." He placed a photograph on top of the pile. A child's school picture. Dark curls, gap-toothed smile, eyes that would never open again. Nancy's knees buckled. She grabbed the bedpost, her vision swimming. "You're lying. You're lying to justify what you've done. Read it yourself." Victor gestured to the evidence scattered before her. Every transaction, every communication, every body he left behind. With shaking hands, Nancy picked up a bank statement. Her father's name. Deposits that matched dates of known attacks. Amounts that made her stomach turn. Another document, encrypted messages decoded. Her father's badge number as the sender identification. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." "Your father's heroism was a lie," Victor said quietly. "And your marriage to me is his debt paid in flesh." Nancy collapsed onto the bed, white gown crumpling around her, rose petals crushed beneath her weight. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the evidence of her father's sins. Everything she'd believed, everything she'd mourned, everything that had defined her, lies. "This is my gentleness," Victor said, his voice almost kind in its cruelty. "I could have hurt you 1,000 ways tonight, Nancy. But I'd rather you understand why you're here." He walked toward the door, each footstep echoing like a funeral march. "Sleep if you can," he said without looking back. "Tomorrow, you'll start learning what it means to be my wife." The lock clicked shut. Nancy was alone with the ghosts of her father's victims and the ruins of her innocence. She slid from the bed to the floor, her back against the wall, still in her wedding gown. Silent sobs racked her body as the city lights flickered through the windows, indifferent to her pain. Dawn light crept through the windows like an unwelcome witness. Nancy hadn't moved. Her makeup was streaked, her dress wrinkled and stained with tears. The evidence still lay scattered across the bed, photographs of the dead staring at nothing. The door unlocked. A woman entered carrying a breakfast tray. Clara, one of the house staff. Her eyes held sympathy, but her mouth remained silent. She'd learned long ago that Victor Waltrip's world had no room for comfort. Clara set the tray down and left quickly, locking the door behind her. Nancy stared at the file, at her father's smiling photograph clipped to the corner of a police report. The man who'd tucked her in at night, who'd taught her to ride a bike, who'd promised to always protect her. The man who'd gotten a 6-year-old killed. The father she'd mourned was a stranger. And the monster who'd married her had told her the truth. Days blurred into one another, each as suffocating as the last. Nancy moved through Victor's mansion like a caged lioness, silent, watchful, learning the contours of her prison. The estate sprawled across 10 acres, each room more opulent than the last. But wealth couldn't disguise what it truly was, a gilded cage. Victor's rules arrived through intermediaries. His lieutenant, a stone-faced man named Marcus, delivered them with military precision. Don't leave the grounds. Don't question the operations. Don't defy Mr. Waltrip. Nancy broke every rule. She read the books in Victor's private library, first editions of Machiavelli and Sun Tzu, margins filled with his handwritten notes. She rearranged objects in his study, moving his favorite whiskey glass 3 inches to the left, just to see if he'd notice. She spoke to his men in the hallways, asking their names, learning their stories. The staff noticed. Whispers followed her through the corridors. "This one has fire," they said. "She's not like the others." And Victor noticed, too. Nancy would catch glimpses of him in doorways, watching her with an expression she couldn't read. Not anger, something closer to fascination. The garden was Nancy's only sanctuary. She spent afternoons among the roses, their thorns somehow comforting in their honesty. One afternoon, Clara approached, her steps hesitant. "Mrs. Waltrip," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder, "be careful." Nancy looked up from the rose she'd been examining. "Careful of what?" Clara's hands twisted in her apron. "The last woman who challenged him." She stopped, fear flickering across her face. Nancy's pulse quickened. "What happened to her?" "She disappeared," Clara whispered, leaning closer. "But sometimes, late at night, I still hear crying from the east wing. The locked section. No one's allowed there. Not even Marcus." Before Nancy could press further, Clara hurried away, leaving behind more questions than answers. A mystery within the prison. And Nancy had never been good at leaving mysteries unsolved. Dinner that evening was their first meal together since the wedding night. Nancy entered the dining room to find Victor already seated, lounging with predatory ease. He'd shed his usual suit for a fitted tank top that revealed the full extent of his tattoos, intricate designs that wrapped around muscled arms, telling stories she couldn't yet read. Nancy sat across from him, spine straight, refusing to show the fear that still lurked beneath her defiance. "When am I allowed to leave this gilded cage?" she asked, her voice steady. Victor's jaw tightened, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "When I trust you won't run." "Then never," Nancy shot back. His laugh was dark, genuine. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," she replied, meeting his steel-gray gaze without flinching. "I expected a monster. But you're just a man haunted by ghosts." Something flashed in his eyes, raw, unguarded. For a heartbeat, his mask cracked, and she glimpsed the man beneath the violence. Then he recovered, his expression hardening like cooling steel. "Careful, Nancy," he said softly. "You don't know what ghosts I carry." "Maybe not," she replied, "but I'm starting to learn." That night, Nancy lay awake in the massive bed, listening. Around midnight, she heard it, soft footsteps in the hallway. She slipped from beneath the covers and followed, keeping to the shadows. Victor moved through the mansion like a specter, his path deliberate. He stopped at a door in the east wing, the forbidden section Clara had mentioned. He unlocked it and disappeared inside. Nancy crept closer, her heart hammering. Through a crack in the door, she saw him standing before a portrait. A beautiful woman with dark hair and sad eyes stared out from the canvas, frozen in time. "I'm sorry, Isabel," Victor whispered, his voice broken in a way Nancy had never heard. "I'm so sorry." Nancy retreated quickly, pulse racing, questions multiplying in her mind. Who was Isabel? And what had happened to make Chicago's most dangerous man weep in the darkness? Nancy waited until Victor's convoy disappeared through the iron gates. She'd watched from her window as he climbed into the black SUV, his lieutenants flanking him like shadows. "Business in the city," Marcus had said. He'd be gone for hours. She moved quickly. The hairpin technique was something her father had taught her. Ironic, given what she now knew about him. The lock on the East Wing study yielded after 30 seconds of careful manipulation. The door swung open with a whisper. The room stole her breath. It was a shrine. Photographs covered every surface. Isabel laughing at a restaurant. Isabel in a summer dress. Isabel with her hand resting on her barely visible belly. Case files were stacked meticulously on shelves. And there, in a glass case like a museum piece, was a blood-stained federal badge. Her father's badge. Nancy's hands shook as she approached the desk. A wedding photograph sat in an ornate frame. Victor, years younger, his smile genuine and unguarded as he stood beside a beautiful woman in white. Isabel. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, her eyes bright with joy that would never see tomorrow. Beside it, a yellowed newspaper clipping. Federal agent's raid ends in tragedy. Bride killed in crossfire. Nancy sank into Victor's chair, her mind racing as pieces assembled themselves into a horrifying picture. The date of the raid matched the date of Isabel's death. The operation had been led by Special Agent Robert Sparks, her father. Additional documents revealed false intelligence, planted by an unknown source, that led federal agents to a supposed weapons cache. But the location wasn't empty. Isabel had been there. The raid went wrong. Gunfire erupted. Isabel Romano died in the crossfire, and Victor Waltrip's world ended with her. Nancy's stomach churned as she read further. Her father had tried to cover up the mistake, to bury the evidence of faulty intelligence. And when that failed, when internal investigations began, he'd started leaking information to Victor's enemies. Insurance, leverage, a desperation. "He married me to punish my father's memory," Nancy whispered to the empty room. Not a political alliance, not a truce. Revenge, pure and calculated. "Found my secrets, did you?" Nancy spun. Victor stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. How long had he been there? "You married me for revenge," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. Victor moved into the room, each step deliberate, dangerous. "I married you because your father took everything from me." Nancy's gaze fell on another document, a medical report partially hidden beneath the newspaper clipping. Prenatal care, 8 weeks gestation. Her breath caught. "She wasn't just your wife." Nancy looked up at him, understanding dawning like a knife to the chest. She was pregnant. Victor's mask shattered. Raw grief flooded his features, transforming the dangerous man into something broken and human. His hand gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles white. 8 weeks, he choked out, his voice barely audible. "I lost them both." The silence stretched between them, heavy with ghosts. Nancy saw him differently now, not as the monster who'd caged her, but as a man destroyed by loss. A man who'd built an empire on the ruins of his happiness. Who'd married his enemy's daughter, not for power, but for the bitter comfort of shared suffering. "Punishing me won't bring them back," Nancy said softly. Victor's laugh was hollow, broken. "No, but it makes me feel less alone in hell." He turned and walked out, leaving her in his shrine of grief. Nancy stayed, surrounded by photographs of a woman she'd never meet, staring at Isabel's smile. She understood now. The cage she lived in wasn't built from cruelty. It was built from a love that had nowhere else to go. Nancy had insisted on accompanying Victor to the dockside meeting. "If I'm your wife," she'd said, "then I should understand your world." Victor had studied her for a long moment before nodding. A test, perhaps, or curiosity about how far her defiance would take her. Now, as the convoy sped through Chicago's industrial district, Nancy stared out at the darkness beyond the tinted windows. Victor sat across from her, silent, his phone casting blue light across his sharp features. The roadblock appeared without warning. "Sir," Marcus started from the front seat. Then the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from all sides. Bullets shattered windows, spraying glass like deadly rain. Tires exploded. The SUV swerved violently, metal screaming as it flipped. Nancy's scream was lost in the chaos. She felt herself thrown sideways. Then Victor's body slammed into hers, his arms wrapping around her head as they tumbled. The vehicle crashed onto its side, momentum dragging them across asphalt. When the world stopped spinning, Victor's weight pressed her into the demolished interior. His grunt of pain was close to her ear. "Stay down!" he roared, somehow producing a gun from his jacket. Blood soaked through his shirt, his shoulder. More gunfire. Victor's men returned fire with brutal efficiency, but they were outnumbered. Nancy's ears rang, her hands slick with blood. Hers or his, she couldn't tell. "We need to move," Victor growled. He kicked out the shattered windshield and dragged Nancy through, his jaw tight with pain. "Into the trees. Now." They ran. Rain began to fall, cold, merciless. Nancy stumbled in her heels, kicked them off, kept running. Behind them, flashlights cut through the darkness, voices shouting in Russian. The Koslov family. Victor was slowing. His breathing came ragged, his left arm hanging useless. Blood streamed down his side, black in the darkness. "Don't you dare die on me," Nancy hissed, ducking under his good arm to support his weight. They reached an abandoned warehouse, its door hanging from rusted hinges. Inside, they collapsed against the wall, gasping. Nancy pulled out her phone, its cracked screen providing just enough light to see by. Victor's shoulder was a mess of blood and torn fabric. "The bullet's still in," she said, her hands shaking. "I need to get it out." Victor's laugh was weak. "You know how? My father taught me field medicine." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. "This will hurt." "Everything hurts," Victor said, but he nodded. Nancy found a piece of metal, sterilized it poorly with rainwater, and tore strips from her already ruined dress. She probed the wound, and Victor's scream echoed through the warehouse, raw and agonizing. "Why are you doing this?" he gasped between waves of pain. Nancy's vision blurred with tears. "Because I hate you," she sobbed, her hands continuing their work, despite shaking violently. "But I don't want you to die." The bullet came free. Victor's weak laugh was both agony and something else. Something almost like hope. "Then maybe I can learn how to live again." As rain hammered the warehouse roof, Victor's fever climbed. His defenses crumbled with his strength. "You look like her," he whispered, his eyes unfocused. Same fire, same fearlessness. Nancy's chest tightened. I'm not her replacement. I know, Victor breathed, his hand finding hers. That's what terrifies me. Dawn brought Marcus and the remaining men. They rushed Victor to a private hospital, Nancy still covered in his blood. She refused to leave his side through surgery, through recovery, her hand gripping his even when he couldn't feel it. As they wheeled him to recovery, Nancy stood in the hallway, exhausted and blood-stained, and realized something that terrified her. Somewhere between hatred and survival, something had shifted. She didn't love him, but she no longer wanted him destroyed. And that changed everything. 2 weeks. Victor had been in a medically induced coma for 2 weeks, while his body fought infection and healed from the bullet wound. Nancy kept vigil in his private hospital room, ignoring the stares from his lieutenants who came and went like shifting shadows. She'd become a fixture there, the wife who shouldn't care, but somehow did. Late one evening, voices drifted from the hallway. Nancy recognized them, Marco and Stefano, 2 of Victor's senior men. With Victor weak, the Kozlov family will strike, Marco said, his voice low. We need new leadership. Transition plans. The shipment in 3 days, Stefano replied. If they hit it, Victor's empire collapses. Finally. Nancy's blood went cold. This wasn't a concern. This was a coup wrapped in false loyalty. The next morning, Nancy approached the mansion. Victor's men reluctantly stepped aside. She was still Mrs. Waltrip after all. His office felt like a mausoleum, everything exactly as he'd left it. She sat behind his massive desk and opened his computer. The login screen appeared. She tried several combinations before typing, Isabel lives in me. The screen unlocked. Nancy's heart ached at the password. A dead woman's ghost still protecting his secrets. She found the encrypted communications quickly. Victor had been thorough, documenting everything. The Kozlov family was planning to ambush a major weapons shipment in 3 days. If successful, they'd cripple Victor's organization beyond recovery. But there was more. Buried in the threads were messages from an internal source. Someone feeding the Kozlovs information. Marco. Nancy scrolled through months of betrayal. Locations, schedules, vulnerabilities. Marco had been playing both sides, waiting for the perfect moment to let Victor's empire burn. She faced a choice that should have been simple. Let the man who'd imprisoned her lose everything, or protect the empire built on her father's grave. But nothing was simple anymore. Nancy called an emergency meeting. When she entered the conference room in a black dress, her hair pulled back severely, the men around the table exchanged glances, amused, dismissive. Mrs. Waltrip, Marco said with barely concealed condescension. This isn't women's business. Nancy slammed a file on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Then explain why you've been texting Dmitry Kozlov hourly. Silence crashed through the room. Marco's smirk faltered. The Kozlov family plans to ambush the shipment at the Northwest docks in 3 days, Nancy continued, her voice steel. They know the route, the timing, the security detail, because Marco has been feeding them information for 6 months. She spread intercepted messages across the table, dates, locations, Marco's burner phone number highlighted in each thread. The shipment route changes, Nancy declared. We will move it tonight through the southern corridor. Marco stood, his face reddening. You don't have authority. Nancy's hand moved to her clutch. She produced Victor's gun, the same one he'd used to defend her, and laid it on the table with deliberate care. I'm Victor's wife, she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Until he wakes, I am the authority. Challenge me, Marco, and I'll put a bullet in you myself. Her father had taught her to shoot. Victor had taught her to survive. The room was submitted. Even Marco sank back into his chair, trapped. That night, Nancy orchestrated the operation from Victor's study, an earpiece connecting her to every vehicle, every checkpoint. She moved the shipment through routes the Kozlovs didn't know existed, her commands precise and unwavering. The Kozlov family ambushed the Northwest docks and found nothing. Nancy's trap sprang. Her men surrounded the confused attackers, capturing them without firing a shot. Victory without bloodshed. Where Victor would have massacred, Nancy had outmaneuvered. When dawn broke, the empire was secure. And Nancy understood. She'd stopped being a prisoner the moment she'd chosen to fight for the cage. Victor's eyes opened to soft morning light, and the face of a woman who shouldn't be there. Nancy slept in the chair beside his hospital bed. Her body curved uncomfortably. Exhaustion etched into every line of her face. File folders lay scattered around her feet, a pen still clutched in her hand. She looked simultaneously fragile and formidable, a contradiction that made something in his chest tighten. He tried to sit up, pain lancing through his shoulder. A nurse appeared immediately, then his doctor. "Mr. Waltrip, welcome back," Dr. Chen said, checking vitals. 3 weeks. "You're lucky to be alive. My men are fine. Your wife saved your life." The doctor glanced at Nancy's sleeping form. "And from what I hear, your empire too." Confusion flickered through Victor's mind. He noticed subtle changes, the way nurses deferred to Nancy even in sleep, how Marcus stood guard outside with newfound respect in his posture. What had happened while he was under? The realization hit him like a second bullet. Nancy hadn't just survived his absence, she'd ruled in his place, and that terrified him more than any enemy ever had. Nancy woke to find Victor sitting up, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. His color had returned, strength seeping back into features that had been too pale for too long. "How long?" His voice was rough from disuse. 3 weeks, she replied, guarded. She'd grown accustomed to making decisions, to being obeyed. Having him awake changed the equation. Victor picked up his phone from the bedside table, scrolling through messages with his good hand. "I've been reading your emails. You restructured my entire operation." Nancy stood, defensive. "I protected what's yours." "Wes?" The question was direct, searching. His steel-gray eyes pinned her in place. "Because?" Nancy struggled to articulate feelings she barely understood herself. "Because letting your enemies win would mean everything, including your pain, was meaningless." Victor's expression softened in a way she'd never seen. "You could have run, let it all burn, been free of me." "Where would I go?" The honesty tasted bitter and true. "My whole life was a lie. At least here, I know what the cage looks like." "And you made it your throne," Victor said quietly. Nancy's breath caught. He understood. Against all odds, this man who'd married her for revenge understood what she'd become. Victor tried to stand, his legs unsteady. Nancy moved instinctively to help, and this time he accepted. They walked the hospital garden together, his arm around her shoulders for support. The first genuinely tender touch they'd shared. "You spared the Kozlov soldiers," Victor observed, his tone neutral. "Mercy isn't weakness," Nancy countered. "I would have killed them all." "I know. That's why they fear you." Nancy met his gaze. "But now they also respect you, through me." Victor stopped, turning her to face him fully. His hand remained on her shoulder, warm and solid. "You're not my prisoner anymore, are you?" Nancy lifted her chin. "No, I'm your partner, whether you like it or not." Something broke in his chest. The wall he'd built from grief, from guilt, from years of choosing violence over vulnerability. It crumbled like sand before a tide, and what rushed in to replace it was something he thought he'd buried with Isabel. Hope. They stood close, breath mingling, heartbeats synchronized. Victor's hand moved to cup her face, his thumb tracing her jawline. Nancy's eyes fluttered closed. Then she pulled back. "Don't confuse gratitude for something else," she said, her voice unsteady. Victor's thumb continued its gentle path along her jaw. "What if it's not confusing?" Nancy's eyes opened, challenging. "Then prove it. Not with words, with change." She walked away, leaving him breathless in the garden. For the first time since Isabel died, Victor felt something besides rage and grief. He felt alive. Moonlight bled through the east wing's cracked window, painting Isabel's shrine in silver grief. Nancy knelt among faded photographs when Victor's shadow fell across her. "I need to tell you everything," he rasped, voice splintered. They sank to the rug. His confession poured like poison. Isabel hadn't died in the crossfire. Marco's father, jealous of Victor's ascent, had slit her throat in the chaos, then pinned it on federal agents to spark war. Robert Sparks uncovered the lie, tried to expose it. Marco's family silenced him forever. "I built this revenge on a corpse of lies," Victor whispered, tears carving tracks through dust on his cheeks. Nancy's own tears answered. "We're both victims of the same monster." She took his trembling hand. "Then let's end this. Together." Alarms shrieked. Windows exploded inward. Kozlov's men swarmed the halls like black floodwater. Victor and Nancy moved as one, back to back. Bullets singing past their ears. Fire licked the wallpaper, devouring silk and secrets. They reached the armory, guns heavy, hearts heavier. "If we die tonight," Victor began. "We're not dying," Nancy cut in, loading a magazine with steady fingers. Marco stepped from the smoke, gun raised. "My father died for your ambition. Now I bury you both." 3 heartbeats, 3 triggers. Nancy fired first. Marco crumpled, blood blooming like poppies on marble. The ceiling groaned, surrendered. Victor threw himself over her as timber rained. They crawled through kitchen tunnels, lungs burning, and burst into the night. Rain lashed the inferno that had been home. Victor stared, hollow. "Everything's gone." Nancy cupped his soot-streaked face. "No, everything rotten is gone. We're still here." Their kiss tasted of ash and absolution. Months later, a modest new mansion gleamed under morning sun. Nancy sat at the boardroom table, equal partner in a cleaner empire. Victor entered with 2 coffees. "Ready, Mrs. Waltrip?" "Always." She smiled, fierce and free. That night, in their bedroom, rain tapped the window like forgiveness. Victor drew her close. "I'll be gentle. I swear." Nancy traced the scar on his shoulder. "I know. This time, it's the truth." They kissed as thunder rolled, cleansing, not judgment, and the cage became a throne. "Where are you watching from?" Drop your country or city in the comment below. If you love this story of survival, protection, and unexpected love, subscribe to our channel for more dark romance tales. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new story. Your support will help us create more content like this. Thank you for being part of community